recognizing the member for Chilliwack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's an honor to speak in front of you once again here in the People's House. I am fully in support of this bill, and I think it's a very important bill. Gun violence is devastating, and it is pervasive in our communities. And even one person shot is one person too many. So, Mr. Speaker, people deserve to feel safe in their communities and their neighborhoods, and what's happening with gun violence and gang activity is unacceptable. The Firearm Violence Prevention Act is about ensuring our police agencies have the right tools to be able to prevent crime, disrupt organized crime groups, and gather evidence in support of successful prosecutions. This legislation is part of our government's multi-pronged approach to target gun and gang violence. The 2017 Illegal Firearms Task Force report provided recommendations to help our government respond to the public threats from illegal firearms in British Columbia, and this legislation represents a major milestone in implementing those recommendations to enhance public safety on illegal firearms and associated violence. There's no question, Mr. Speaker, that the vast majority of firearms owners in British Columbia are law-abiding. I myself, I grew up in a family that did target shooting and hunting and that sort of thing, and they always followed the law. And this bill would not affect them very much. It is designed to target gang violence, for sure. It targets illegal and imitation firearms and will have virtually no impact on legal firearms owners. I looked at the legislation and I can't see where it would affect myself or my family. We're prohibiting the sale of imitation firearms and low-velocity firearms to youth, with the understanding that it is quite common for youth to grow up using airsoft or BB guns. I certainly had one, particularly in rural BC, and this won't change. Youth can still receive them as gifts and will be permitted to use them if no prohibition against the discharge of firearms or imitation firearms exists in their communities. Police say that it's extremely difficult to tell whether these imitation firearms and low-velocity firearms are real or not, which can place the carrier, often youth, in critical danger. As well, criminals use these imitation firearms to threaten and strong-arm innocent folks. And it's important to note that the crime and violence are not uniquely urban phenomenon. Rural and remote communities may be more vulnerable due to isolation, timeliness of response, availability of community resources. Chilliwack is not free of gun violence. It's definitely not a place that is free of gangs. I don't know, many of you may have heard of the United Nations gang. The founder, it was founded in Chilliwack. And so we do have, or had, a pretty big problem, and this bill works to address that. You know, I've seen gun violence up close. I had a close friend. I had a pretty nasty work accident, and so I was rehabbing at GF Strong. Lived there for a little while, actually. And there was a young man who shared a room with me, and he was a doorman at a club in downtown Vancouver, and he was shot in the back with a shotgun. And he was very hurt. He lives with a lot of pain now, a lot of nerve pain. He uses a wheelchair. And if we had something like this 22 years ago, 23 years ago now, I think it's possible that this piece of legislation could have prevented such a tragic outcome. You know, firearms are an area of shared legislative authority between the Government of Canada and Province of British Columbia. And the Government of Canada has jurisdiction over national firearms regulations and control in the Firearms Act and the criminal use of firearms in the Criminal Code. My friend, the member of Langley, is a lawyer. He's keenly aware of this. The province has jurisdiction over firearms with regard to public safety and law enforcement, and the use of firearms while hunting in the Wildlife Act. You know, under existing federal legislation, restricted, for example, handguns, and some long guns are restricted as well, and prohibitive firearms, machine guns. Owners have federal authorizations that limit where they can possess and transport these firearms. Generally, they are only allowed to take the firearm from their residence to target practice at a gun range, a gunsmith or a gun show, or a peace officer or chief firearms officer for verification, registration, or disposal. I think the member from Langley's been to gun shows before, he just said. However, non-restricted firearms, example, hunting rifles, are not subject to the same possession and transportation restrictions where imitation firearms and low-velocity firearms are largely unregulated. And many schools and other designated properties have policies prohibiting the possession of firearms and other types of weapons on their premises. But currently, when a person brings a lawful firearm or imitation firearm to school grounds in violation of school policy, there's little recourse for law enforcement if the person is not otherwise committing an offense. Establishing this prohibition will allow for enforcement action when a person unlawfully brings a firearm or imitation firearm onto a designated property, such as a school, hospital, or place of worship. And this prohibition closes the gap that exists for non-restricted, low-velocity, and imitation firearms. The development of this legislation is in response to the 37 recommendations made by the 2017 Illegal Firearms Task Force report. The recommendations in the final report include changes to legislation and enforcement policies, as well as recommendations relating to policing policy, education, and prevention. And the objectives of the Illegal Firearms Task Force were to examine provincial and federal legislation, interdiction, and enforcement policies, identify gaps and needs to combat illegal possession and illegal use of firearms within BC. And they were tasked with developing a report with key findings and recommendations to be presented to the Minister of Public Safety and Solicitor General. And the task force was led by Mr. Wayne Rideout. He was recently appointed as an Assistant Deputy Minister and Director of Police Services. He's a retired RCMP member who held the rank of Assistant Commissioner and for several years had been in charge of investigative services and organized crime in British Columbia. Between September 2016 and February 2017, the task force, consisting of experts with a wide range of experience in managing firearms and organized crime in BC, reviewed and surveyed existing published research, interviewed numerous individuals and organizations, and conducted community consultations around the province. The continuing need for this legislation is highlighted by the recent increase in gang and other forms of violence in British Columbia. So this legislation is designed to disrupt gang activity, such as drive-by shootings and the supply of imitation firearms to youth by gang members for use as an intimidation tool and low-level drug dealing, like I mentioned before. The legislation will also make it more difficult for gang members to use legitimate shooting ranges for target practice and give police more tools to impound vehicles and seize firearms related to gang activity. We do not want gangsters practicing how to shoot at shooting ranges, that's for sure. The province's mandate with this legislation is to increase public safety, by addressing enforcement gaps in existing federal and provincial legislation, such as regulating imitation firearms that are currently unregulated. And this bill is intended to fill those gaps. I could go on, Mr. Speaker, but I think I'll leave it there. I think all members of this House should be supporting this legislation. So I've heard members from both sides saying that they will support this legislation, and so I think that is a good thing. It's a good thing for British Columbians. It's a good thing for our youth, and it's a good thing for anyone who gets in or has the potential of getting in the crossfire of gang activity. Thank you.